The title of this lecture might seem a little odd. The peace settlements, because certainly you're aware, well, there was a peace treaty, the Versailles Treaty, that ended the First World War. So why are we talking about peace settlements? Well, what I want to talk to you about in this short review is not simply the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that ended the First World War, but in many ways sort of the visions for the post-war world. What would that represent? And in looking at three different settlements or attempts at settlements, we can see that there were different visions as to what the post-war world might look like. And so I want to take you through each one in turn. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, then the 14 points, and then finally the treaty we ended up with that ended the war, namely the Treaty of Versailles. So to begin with, looking at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This treaty was the one signed between Germany and the Soviet Union, the communist state that had overtaken the Russian provisional government. We'll get to in the next lecture the revolution of 1917 and all the rest, but this is an important treaty in terms of presenting the type of treaty we may have expected, or the type of peace we may have expected had Germany truly won the war. And indeed, as you can already see, it is a punishing peace. This is a, if you will, a victor's peace. This is a peace in which Germany is looking for total victory to justify their sacrifices during the war. It demands immediate demobilization of the Russian troops and cessation of hostilities and demobilization of any threat against the German forces. But more than that, it carves apart the Russian Empire. It demands the independence of Finland, of the Baltic states, of Belarus and Ukraine. It demands the Ottoman Empire regain Armenia and Georgia that they had lost in the Russo-Turkish War that we talked about in 1877 and 1878. Now, you look at independence and that sounds good. Oh, nice, look, the Germans are standing up for nationalism. They're letting people find their way. Well, not really. All of these states were destined in German minds to either be functionally puppet states under their control or neutrals that were utterly dependent on Germany for protection and their economy. So this is an attempt to grab hold of a massive amount of territory at Russia's expense. And if the countries don't really make it clear, perhaps some cold hard numbers will. These are a listing of the losses of the Russian state in the territories that would be confiscated by Brest-Litovsk or made independent. And I think it's helpful to start with this because it's a sign of the type of harsh peace treaty that Germany was more than content to inflict on their opponents. I think that's important because we tend to approach the Versailles Treaty believing it to be the worst of all possible treaties, and certainly wasn't it so nasty, mean and cruel to Germany. Well, that may be true, or you can assess that not to be true, but I think it's helpful to contextualize it. You need to look at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and then comparing that, assess, well, is Germany really right in decrying the Versailles Treaty as much as they are compared to the types of peace terms they're more than willing to inflict on their defeated foes. Now, another vision for peace came from President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. America was neutral at the outbreak of the war, and while they increasingly provided goods and arms and food to the Entente, President Wilson was trying to work for peace throughout the war. Eventually, when America was dragged into the war, Wilson was forced to contemplate, well, what possible basis for future peace could there be? As an intellectual, Wilson was formerly a professor at Princeton. Wilson believed in the capacity of man to improve himself and the ability of man to create perhaps a peaceful future. And more than anything, he hoped that at the end of this great war, the war to end all wars, there might be an opportunity to craft a true and lasting peace, something that would ensure peace thereafter in the aftermath of this great struggle. And he outlined his principles in a document known as the 14 Points. Now, I've not listed all of them here, but I've laid out a couple just to lay out the themes or the if you will, the principles behind what Wilson is proposing. And it's telling that Wilson, in his desire for peace, wanted to build a peace treaty around certain terms, certain principles that would not simply bring peace, but as far as he was concerned, fix the problems that had led to war in the first place. Again, what he's hoping for is crafting a peace that will last. So for example, point 1, no private treaties. What he's seeking to prevent is the very alliance system and secret treaties that had not only pushed Europe towards war, but dragged more countries into the conflict as wars continued, as the war continued. Point 2 and 3 were pushing back against the actions of powers during the war. Freedom of the sea and the equality of trade. He's pushing back against not only the German submarine threat, which helped bring the United States into the war, but also against the British blockade itself. But by far the most important part of his declaration, though certainly the Poles, who've been longing for their country since the partition of Poland, thought point 13 was a fantastic one. By far, Wilson's most important point was his last one. And this was indeed what Wilson hoped for, most of all. He wanted to create, as he termed it, a League of Nations. What Wilson wanted to create was an arena in which the nations of the world could come together, assemble, and settle problems amicably and peacefully. He hoped it would provide a forum where nations could settle their disagreements, which he knew would come, peaceably and amicably without having to resort to war. And in the end, when we get to the Versailles Treaty, Wilson was ready to sacrifice nearly all the other principles in this document in order to achieve that League of Nations, because he believed more than anything it would create the structure necessary to bring about a peaceful world in the aftermath of the First World War. And so finally, we arrive at the Versailles Treaty. Now, despite being a treaty signed by the Entente with the Central Powers, with Germany, the real debates about Versailles were more between the victors. Wilson arrives with his vision of the 14 points, while France and Britain arrive with various strands of desires for revenge. They who have sacrificed so much, they who have lost so much, wanting to punish Germany and prevent it from ever arising again. Even the power of Italy, which had stayed neutral at the outbreak of war and then joined the side of the Entente, had its own desires to be there, mostly in that they were promised territory in the Balkans that they wanted to see claimed. And so you have a variety of victors debating over what the nature of the treaty shall be. And Germany, the defeated power, well, Versailles was no Congress of Vienna. The German delegation was, at the end, simply presented the Versailles Treaty and told, you must sign this or the war resumes. There was no attempt to try and reconcile. There was no attempt to be concerned about a balance of power. Indeed, this suggests the type of treaty that we're going to get. What were the terms of the Versailles Treaty? In it, you saw the dismemberment of most of the empires that went off to the war engaged in the struggle. Austria-Hungary was destroyed as a polity, being broken into a number of different countries, including Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Russia lost Finland, Poland, and the Baltic states. And the Eastern question, if you will, was finally solved by the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire. The Middle East holdings were carved up between Great Britain and France, while the rest of the Ottoman Empire proper was transformed into the nation-state of Turkey. And as for Germany, Germany was singled out for punishment. Their country was not dismantled, though it certainly lost some territory. But Germany was forced to disarm and was thereafter pledged to remain within certain limits of their army and armed forces and what weapons they were able to purchase or develop, precisely to prevent the German army from ever becoming a threat to peace. Germany also had to pay a massive reparation. They needed to pay a figure that was eventually settled by the early 1920s at around 6.6 billion pounds. Now you might ask, why does Germany have to pay this reparation? Well, in signing the Versailles Treaty, Germany is accepting Article 231 of the treaty, the so-called war guilt clause of the Versailles Treaty. It stipulated that Germany, by signing this treaty, agreed that it, Germany, the only nation, was responsible for all the losses and all the devastation caused by the war. Now, if we think back to the outbreak of the war, That certainly doesn't seem to be the case, that there's more than a few people at fault in terms of why war comes. But this treaty lays out in stark terms that Germany is at fault, and by signing it, Germany admits it is the cause of the First World War and deserves to be punished for it. Now, in any of those clauses, you might say, well, that doesn't seem very much like a 14 points peace. And Wilson, despite his grand hopes, arrives at the negotiations unable to really convince his compatriots of the need for this more kinder peace to ensure perhaps a more peaceful world in the aftermath of the First World War. But he does achieve one of his aims. He gets his League of Nations. He gets what he believes will be the foundation for a future peace, regardless of maybe the terms of this treaty being harsher than he would like. The problem for Wilson is that while he is able to achieve this League of Nations, his crowning diplomatic achievement in Paris, or in Versailles rather, his countrymen do not agree with his grand principles. Upon returning to the United States, Republican senators, resistant to a foreign treaty that they believe might drag the United States into a war that's not in their interests, vote down the treaty, and the U.S. Does not ratify the Versailles Treaty, nor does it join the League of Nations. Now, some have suggested that the failure of the United States to join the League of Nations doomed the world to the Second World War. But I think that's a bit too much. I think the bigger issue with the Versailles Treaty is it's not really a peace treaty. While it did bring an end to the conflict and settled some of the issues that led to the Great War, the treaty also created new issues that would be the cause of the next war. As the French General Ferdinand Foch observed rather presciently, this wasn't a peace. It was simply an armistice. And indeed, the issues would grow and fester until breaking out into a more devastating war, the Second World War.